Hi, this is Green Philosophy. Today I'm going to be sharing with you an original essay on why Henry David Thoreau is useless for the left. Many literature professors and countercultural types have a fondness for Henry David Thoreau. After spending some time exploring his seminal work, Walden, I came to the conclusion that other 19th century work, such as The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin, is more useful for the improvement of society. Firstly, Thoreau was Harvard educated, an opportunity the majority of individuals from his time and today's did not have. Subsequently, because of Thoreau's completion of a university degree from Harvard College, Thoreau had access to social capital, New England's intellectual circle, of which Ralph Waldo Emerson dominated. Thus, Thoreau's elite education granted him access to New England's premier intellectual, Emerson, which in turn permitted Thoreau to, quote, squat on Emerson's land rent-free. Thoreau admits that the majority of individuals in 19th century Concord and Boston were either low-paid day laborers, the Irish, or members of the petite bourgeoisie, small-scale property owners, that is, people who had inherited farms from their fathers. A small minority of New England residents were members of the bourgeoisie, who owned the factories, including elements of the garment industry. Thoreau admits that the garment workers, mostly the uneducated, newly arrived immigrants from the bottom rungs of society, were exploited by the companies that hired them. That is what makes Thoreau's declaration that, quote, the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation, end quote, an unimaginative sentiment. Thoreau makes the classic American mistake of promoting the ideology of individualism and, subsequently, the conservative or modern Republican idea that individuals are poor because of lack of virtue exhibited by individuals and a blindness to the systematic factors that create poverty. What makes Thoreau's tunnel vision inexcusable is that Thoreau, as a figure from the 19th century, should have been familiar with major European voices that are critical of the structural weaknesses of capitalism. Admittedly, Peter Kropotkin does come later, in the 1890s, but Marx and Hegel did so in the mid-19th century as well. In Capital, Volume 1, Marx lays out his theory of surplus value, explaining how capitalists profit by paying workers less than the value of what their labor produces. For instance, today a teacher in Florida who earns $60,000 a year and instructs a caseload of 140 students brings in $1,738,100 for his or her charter school, minus the cost of salaries and the maintenance for the school. If you thought the exploitation of labor was better in northern progressive states, you would be wrong. Assuming the teacher of New York paid at the higher end of the pay scale, $120,000, the state subsidies per student are greater at $33,970 per student. If we multiply this by 140, a teacher in New York brings in $4,755,800 of revenue, minus the expense of other teacher salaries and the maintenance for the school. In Peter Kropotkin's Conquest of Bread, 1892, he lays out his vision for a decentralized, cooperative, and communist society where the production and distribution are organized for human rather than for profit. Kropotkin dissolves and repudiates Thoreau's claim that if a worker is frugal, he can achieve financial independence. Kropotkin maintains that a cobbler might own his own tools and have great skill, but the cobbler does not control the conditions of production or of exchange. To make shoes, the cobbler needs leather, thread, tools, and a workshop, all of which are produced or controlled by others who control prices and access. When the cobbler tries to sell his shoes, he must compete with factory-made shoes produced by capitalists who own machinery and employ wage labor. Because of this competition, the cobbler cannot set fair prices or earn enough to live comfortably. He is forced to sell cheaply or go out of business. Thus, even though he works for himself, he is economically dependent on the capitalist system, on suppliers, middlemen, and market forces beyond his control. This raises the question, to use Thoreau's phrase, do the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation because of the oppression inherent in capitalism? Marx would say yes, 1867. Kropotkin would say yes, 1892. But nothing in Walden, 1854, says anything of the sort. A ChatGPT search says that in Thoreau's era of 1854, approximately 40 to 45% of the labor force worked in agriculture as farm laborers, 25 to 30% worked in manufacturing, in textile mills, shoemaking, metalwork, etc. Then 10 to 15% worked as merchants and as sailors. Since Thoreau earned a living from white-collar work and through intellectual pursuits, he is an outlier and subsequently ill-equipped to cast judgment on the daily experiences of the majority of his countrymen. In addition, Thoreau was a lifelong bachelor at a time when 60 to 65% of adult men and 55 to 60% of adult women in New England in 1850 were married. Thoreau was a further outlier as he was childless. 80 to 85% of married couples in New England had children living with them. If we look at the total adult population, including singles, that works out to approximately 45 to 50% of adults having children at home. Thoreau says, quote, "I have found that by working 6 weeks in a year, I can meet all the expenses of living. I have thoroughly tried school keeping and found my expenses were incomparably greater than my income. I have tried trade, but I found that it would never do, unless I could live by it without capital. I have tried farming, but I found that I was not born to be a farmer. I have not maintained any children. Since we established earlier that the dominant industries in New England in 1850 were agriculture, manufacturing, and trade, and Thoreau found success in none of the above, it is bizarre that Thoreau never thought to criticize the industrial system in place dominated by capital for any of his personal struggles and failures. Here is another situation where Marx's analysis is more useful. In 1875, Marx said, quote, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs," end quote. The takeaway should be that individuals require fewer material resources and money than do large families that have more mouths to feed. One concrete example of Marx's, quote, "to each according to his need," end quote, implemented within the real world occurred between 1942 to 1945 in the form of World War II ration books. Dr. Richard Wolff, a prominent left economist, brought up the fact that credits to redeem milk were distributed on the basis of family size. What is so frustrating about Thoreau's argument is that, of course, the monastic option, quote unquote, in Morris Berman's phrasing, that is, a bachelor living a countercultural lifestyle without financial dependence, i.e. children, requires fewer resources to maintain than a married couple with children, and, for that matter, a single mother with children clearly requires more resources than that of a society rejecting bachelor. Thoreau is acting like, quote, Captain Obvious, end quote, in this instance. Another major blind spot of Thoreau's is his enthusiasm about Eastern religions. Hinduism via the Bhagavad Gita, Buddhism, Taoism. While I think Thoreau is right to criticize the hypocrisy of the wealth-seeking of most New England Christians and the wealth-seeking of Christians today, I find Marx's, quote, "religion is the opiate of the masses," end quote, 1844, from a contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, more convincing. In Walden's Thoreau, he says, quote, "The Mohammedans," a late 19th century term for Muslims, "I suppose, have no such busy care about accumulating property. They live more simply and in accordance with their laws and faith, content with little, and therefore freer in some respects than we are." While hindsight is 20/20, Thoreau could never have anticipated that the current king of Saudi Arabia, King Salman, has a net worth of 18 to 20 billion and owns Rolls Royces and Bentleys worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Another foolish religionist attitude of Thoreau, quote, "Morning brings back the heroic ages. I was much affected by the faint hum of a mosquito," end quote. As an ecologist and environmentalist, I agree that mosquitoes occupy an important role within their habitat and within ecosystems and the web of life in general. However, I found it bizarre that Thoreau romanticized an insect that led to mass death. For the period of 1850 to 1860, malaria was endemic in many parts of the United States, and a study reports that in 1850 there were 45.7 deaths per 1,000 people due to malarial fevers in certain regions. Another area where Thoreau is off base is his attitude about voting. Thoreau says, quote, "All voting is a sort of gaming, like checkers or backgammon, with a slight moral tinge to it, a playing with right and wrong, and one party is merely more successful in cheating than the other." Thoreau's contemporary, Hawthorne, was a lifelong Democrat because of the practical and personal benefits from the Democratic Party. Patronage, such as jobs in the Customs House and consulship. In addition, the Democratic Party's modest government and anti-Whig, anti-aristocratic, anti-elite sentiment appealed to Hawthorne. Here I find Hawthorne's approach more useful than Thoreau's. Adam Smith, in 1776, developed the theory of rational choice in The Wealth of Nations. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from the regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but their self-love, and never talk to them of our necessities, but of their advantages. Later, John Michael Greer develops upon Adam Smith's concept of rational actors within an economy with a description of how the practice of voting is a useful mechanism with which for society to make collective choices. What ought to be called, quote, real democracy, end quote, is the cumbersome, corrupt, flawed, but functional system that emerges when real human beings have the right to elect officials and vote on issues. In conclusion, Thoreau's lack of realistic solutions to the economic, social, and political pathologies of his day, and ours, makes his thinking much less useful than that of Adam Smith of the 18th century and that of Marx, Hegel, and Kropotkin of the 19th century. I look forward to your questions and comments.